Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 86. Aunt May. The last few months had been incredibly difficult times in the Parker household. May and Ben had never once regretted taking Peter in, May especially. She and Ben had never been able to have children, and she'd felt the lack keenly. Peter had filled that void, which wasn't to say that Ben hadn't adored Peter. He had. It had just been slightly different for Ben than it had been for her. Peter had been a sweet baby and an easygoing, happy child. They'd had relatively few problems with him. Not that Peter was a saint or any such thing, but he'd been a good boy. Bright, top of his class. Not much given to trouble, save being a target for bullies thanks to his intelligence and academic zeal. And oh, he had so much potential, it almost hurt to see. She and Ben had scrimped and saved what they could towards college for Peter and determined that he'd get a chance to reach that potential. It hadn't been much, not on their pensions, but every little bit helped. She supposed they'd been due for a bout of teenage rebellion and angst. She sincerely doubted that any parent got through their child's entire childhood without some sort of trouble somewhere, and they'd been lucky up to this point. It may have been longer ago than she was willing to admit, but she could still remember chafing under her parents' authority at his age herself. The problem lay in the fact that it had started so suddenly. There had been absolutely no sign of trouble on the horizon, and then suddenly Peter was skipping school, acting oddly, and lying to them, and doing a poor job of hiding the school skipping, not to mention being a rather poor liar. It had been extremely worrying, and she and Ben had perhaps not handled it particularly well. May had actually feared Peter had gotten into drugs for a week or so before she realized that wasn't the problem. May had begun to suspect something other than general teenage rebellion fairly quickly. His behavior wasn't consistent with drug or alcohol abuse. There were differences in Peter that were kind of hard to miss if you knew him well. Differences that didn't jive with normal teenage defiance and self-expression any more than they did with alcohol and drug abuse. Things like the way he moved changing fairly radically. Like the fact he'd suddenly gained a lot of muscle that he was desperately trying to hide and failing miserably under two big shirts. Like the fact she'd caught him once reading without his glasses, and the book hadn't been all but glued to his nose. Unfortunately, she hadn't divined the cause of the changes as easily as she'd seen them, and Ben hadn't had any more luck than she had. Then things had just gotten worse, and Ben was killed by a robber, so the robber could get away from the cops on his tail by using Ben's car. The loss had been devastating. May and Ben had been married almost 40 years, and Ben had been the only father Peter had truly known. Oh, Peter had a few vague memories of his real father, but they were faded and distant by his own admission. After that, May hadn't been in much of a position to wonder at the changes or figure out a cause. She still wasn't really, but she was more functional than she'd been in the first weeks after Ben's death. Just to make matters worse, money had become an issue. Without Ben's pension, money had become extremely tight. May point-blank refused to use the small savings they'd earmarked for Peter. Not only would that make getting a degree that much more difficult for Peter, but the savings would only delay the inevitable by a few months. It was only a matter of time before she and Peter would have to move elsewhere no matter what they tried. The house was simply beyond May's means to afford on her own. That fact was a bitter blow, all on its own. She and Ben had bought this house together shortly after they'd married. They'd lived their whole lives here, raising Peter here. There were so many memories in this house, the vast majority of them good ones. Peter would do what he could to help if he found out, of course, but May refused to put that burden on him. He was a boy yet, not even of age. He had no call to be trying to get a job and support the pair of them, especially right now when Peter was struggling with whatever was going on with him, as well as Ben's death. Though the last day or two, he'd seemed different yet again. A bit easier in himself, perhaps, but also nervous, like he was working himself up to something. He'd also been refusing to look her in the eye. May dearly hoped he was working up the nerve to tell her what was wrong. He might not be able to actively help, depending on what the problem was, but in her experience, even a sympathetic listening ear did a body good when it came to dealing with your problems. They'd just finished dinner when Peter took a deep breath and said, "Aunt May, I need to talk to you about something." "Of course, Peter. You can tell me anything, you know that," May said, patting the back of his hand. Peter swallowed nervously, and when he looked her in the eye, May was horrified. There was actual fear in Peter's eyes, fear of her. Her reaction to whatever he had to tell her, of all the... May fought Anna off. Depending on what he had to tell her, she might not be happy with him, but he would never have reason to fear her, and he ought to know that. Then again, the mind didn't always tend to be reasonable. It liked to blow things all out of proportion if you gave it the chance. And Peter had been chewing on this whatever it was for about 2 months now. More than enough time for him to start fretting about ridiculous things. You remember that trip we took to Oscorp a couple of months ago at school? And I got real sick the next day. Enough so you let me skip school? Yes, I remember that. What about it? May asked. At the same time, she mentally prayed that Peter hadn't somehow been exposed to something that would eventually kill him. Losing him so soon after Ben would devastate her, and she'd be forced to scold him for hiding it from her for so long. Well, they were doing experiments on spiders. One of them managed to escape its cage and ended up biting me. After I got done being so sick, well... Peter grimaced, then did something that made May's eyes go wide. He leapt straight up and stuck to the ceiling. May gasped, one hand going to her chest, eyes wide with worry. This was... well, not quite what she'd feared, but nearly as bad. What if this eventually killed him? Young man, you and I are going to have a long talk about hiding serious physical changes from me, regardless of the situation at the time otherwise. May scolded, her tone sharper than she truly meant it to be, but this was scaring her half to death. In the meantime, we need to get you looked at, young man, to make sure this isn't hurting you somehow that you can't see. Peter dropped back down into a seat. That's, the other thing. I kind of ran into the Avengers. Peter Parker, do not tell me you weren't. But May saw the truth of it in his eyes. He had been out that day when the aliens had invaded. I have to put you over my knee, young man. Putting yourself at risk like that when you don't even know what that bite will do to you. Amusingly enough, it was that scolding that finally seemed to reassure Peter that she wasn't going to, well, do whatever it was he feared she'd do. Actually, I didn't run into them until after. I've been helping out as much as I can after school, Peter told her. That much she'd known. She'd gone downtown herself quite a bit, usually to one of the food distribution areas. She might be older and not able for the sort of physically demanding work that the rescue and construction crews were doing, but she knew how to cook. Her being behind a plant allowed a younger person to help with the tasks she couldn't do. Anyway, it was a couple of teens that were working with them. They noticed me doing things a kid my size really shouldn't be able to. At May's fulminating glare, Peter flinched a bit. I wasn't showing off, honest, Aunt May. It's just kind of hard to judge what I could lift before this happened versus what I can lift now. I mess it up sometimes. May relaxed. All right, Peter, I believe you. And if you've gotten so strong, I can see where you might have troubles. She agreed. They invited me to the tower if I wanted, and, well, Peter flailed my hand. I got bit and got powers. Of course I wanted. I don't know anything about this, and it's been scaring me half to death. Peter flushed. I've been having nightmares about turning into a spider or, well, all sorts of awful stuff. May could well imagine. She'd probably be having a few of those herself in the coming weeks. And it's not like I can trust a regular doctor or a hospital with this, you know? Peter continued. Some of them are really crappy to mutants, or might use me as a test subject for, well, things I want no part of, you know? May understood and agreed with that wholeheartedly. She might not like troublemaker mutants one bit, but there was no call for medical professionals of all people to treat mutants badly. Yet far too many, one being too many in May's mind, did. So you went and talked to them? Yeah! Then Peter got distinctly starry-eyed, much to May's amusement. Dr. Banner was there, Aunt May! I got to talk to him for a while! Well, that certainly explained the starry-eyed look. And Mr. Stark? She asked, knowing the man was second on Peter's list of people he wanted to meet. Peter pouted slightly. Wasn't there? He and some of the Avengers were... Peter flung a hand skyward. Well, not on the planet. Which, can I just say that blows my mind? May actually laughed in agreement. Space, other words. If she was younger, she'd be strongly tempted to take a peek herself if it was possible to wrangle such a thing. Anyway, Dr. Banner took some samples so they'd be able to find out if all this Peter waved at himself, is stable. And they're willing to help me learn what all I can do, and better control of the strength, at least. That is good news. Though the next time you go, young man, I'll be going with you. It's not that I don't trust them, but you're my responsibility until you come of age, and I have every intention of understanding as much as I can of what's happened. Then May leveled a flat glare at Peter. And we will be having a long discussion, young man, about you keeping secrets. On top of the one about hiding physical changes? Peter asked cheekily with a grin. May slapped at him, which he dodged easily. At least now I know. I knew something was troubling you, she told him. You had Ben and I both worried. Peter's expression twisted, and May had to take a deep breath to keep from tearing up. Now, do you know when you need to go back? She asked. They didn't specify, but I thought I'd check in tomorrow, Peter said. Worst comes to worst, the samples haven't been completely investigated yet, and I can work on figuring out my abilities. Then he blinked. Oh, that reminds me! Fair warning! The Black Widow is utterly terrifying! Peter shivered hard. May had to fight not to laugh. Is she so? She asked. Peter made a face at her. You mock me now, but you'll see! He proclaimed with another shiver. I'm pretty sure the aliens cut and run because she scared them to death, to be honest. May did laugh at that, thoroughly amused by Peter's rather over-the-top antics. Even if she did have a sneaking suspicion he was diverting her attention away from something he wasn't ready to talk about yet. Well, she could wait him. It truly wasn't as bad, in the sense of Peter potentially dying, or as he pointed out, continuing to mutate into a spider. As the news he'd broken to her today, she was entirely too happy he'd finally opened up to her to push. So, what was Dr. Banner like? She asked. Peter grinned hugely. He was awesome, he proclaimed. His lab was better. And there went the starry-eyed look. May strangled the amused noise she wanted to make at Peter's enthusiasm. I mean, he had equipment I didn't even know what it was in there, Peter admitted. Which sort of makes sense because he's, not in the same sort of sciences as me, exactly. Not to mention that it being Stark Tower, it's probably stuff only someone like Mr. Stark could afford. Peter got a dreamy look on his face. Maybe I can get him to let me run a small experiment or something when we go over there.